we're not going to care about the things that are out of our control, to leverage the frustration from errors. So we're going to apply this to our language learning so that neuroplasticity could work in our favor. Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. So in today's video, we are talking about how not to be afraid of speaking a foreign language when you're just learning it, i.e. when you're not fluent. Towards the end of this video, I will present some evidence-based tips about learning, especially language learning, in relation to making mistakes. As always, because I value your time, there are going to be timestamps in the description section and in the pinned comments, so feel free to skip to the bits that you like if you feel like it. I broke this video down into broadly two parts. Firstly, we're going to talk about fears and try to dissect them, like fear of making mistakes, fear of being misunderstood, and fear of not being able to understand people, and fear of being laughed at, being judged. And in the second part of this video, I'm going to talk about how to deal with the fear or how to conquer the fear, although conquering is kind of a strong word, by telling yourself things like you're still practicing the language, you're still learning the language, people are a lot nicer with your language skill than you think, and focusing on things that are in our control and giving yourself plenty of room to make mistakes, and lastly, leveraging the frustration from errors. So let's get started. Firstly, we're going to talk about some of the common fears and then try to dissect them when speaking a foreign language, because I think it is a great first step to deal with the fears or conquer the fears. And the first fear we are talking about is the fear of making mistakes. So whether it's a grammatical mistake, mispronouncing the words, and using incorrect vocabularies, and maybe being culturally insensitive because you're just learning the language and you're not really familiar with the culture. So this can definitely make people self-conscious and frustrated. I mean, I definitely make so many mistakes, actually to the point that I'm used to make mistakes, but definitely in the beginning it made me sort of like discouraging and made me feel a little bit down. When I was a beginner in German, I used to worry about making grammatical mistakes all the time. I was thinking like, was this word inseparable or separable? And what was the past perfect form for this word? You know, because German grammar is hard and there were a lot to digest, and because I kept forgetting things, that sort of made me self-conscious when I spoke German. And the second fear we are talking about is the fear of being misunderstood. When you're not fluent in a language, especially in the beginning, you may be afraid of being misunderstood. Your pronunciation and accent might be a little bit far from the native speakers, which is totally fine. Maybe you didn't use the best word to describe a certain situation, and also making grammatical mistakes could lead to misunderstanding. I think I had some experience being misunderstood, especially in German. So this was my early days in Germany, and I called the Deutschlandstudio to talk about, paying a cable fee, because everybody has to pay for a cable fee in Germany. And talking on the phone is actually key here, because when you're not fluent in the language, it's harder to understand people on the phone. And it's harder to sort of like express yourself on the phone because, you're not looking at the eyes and you're not looking at their mouth, how they pronounce their words, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, at least to me, it feels a little bit harder to understand people on the phone. So, unsurprisingly, because I was not fluent at all, I had a lot of trouble expressing myself, expressing my situation and why I called that kind of stuff. So the person on the other line probably couldn't really understand what I was saying. So I think her patience was like getting thin and she ended up like hanging up the phone. I thought, well, it is totally understandable because I was the one who couldn't really describe the situation. I couldn't really describe what my problems were. So she couldn't really understand. That was a good experience. So what I did afterwards is that I practiced some phrases and expressions that I needed for describing my situation and what my problems are. And I called them back and problem solved. But definitely this can be quite discouraging, not being able to make the other person understand what you're saying, but also fear of being misunderstood. And the third fear I would like to touch on is the fear of not being able to understand other people. It is one of my greatest concerns, especially in the beginning of my journey toward fluency, because we can have a proper conversation if I don't understand the other one. Another experience of mine happened in Germany just because I went to Germany when I was a beginner in German, not because I have some sort of bias in German. For the other languages I could speak, English and Japanese, I went to Japan and the United States after I reached the intermediate level, so I was able to understand people. But so yeah, it happened in one of my early interactions in Germany. So I was talking to this person and I gotta say I couldn't really understand this person, and I asked him to repeat like once or twice because I couldn't really understand him. And after making him repeat, I still couldn't understand, but I ended up saying some stuff anyway just to get the conversation running. But he said in English, "Hey, do you realize that we're having two different conversations?" I was like, oh no. This was a great reminder that I needed to work harder on my listening skill. Since then, whenever I learn a new language, I like to work harder on my listening skill than speaking skill. I mean, when it comes to conversation skills, because I really need to understand the other person before I could say something in response properly. And fear number 4 might be people are laughing or judging your language skill or as a person. This might be the greatest fear that many people have. In the beginning of the language learning journey, pretty much everybody is self-conscious and they're not obviously fluent. So it is certainly possible that we imagine people like in our head laughing at us. I don't really remember being laughed at my language skills, but I definitely got some judgmental looks, and one of them would just walk away from the conversation without properly ending it. So yeah, this could definitely happen. When we engage in a conversation, we don't just talk about our days, but we also talk about family and friends, economics and politics, and how the classes are going, how the professors are, and international relations, all the kind of stuff. You may have something interesting to say about this, but you may not just have the right terminologies to describe these. Here, a fear of being seen as unintelligent or ignorant can arise. Okay, let's now talk about how to deal with these fears or how to conquer these fears. So I gotta say, one approach doesn't necessarily correspond to one fear or another, but one approach might apply to multiple fears. And these are the things that I want you to keep in mind or tell yourself if you have any of those fears that I talked about earlier. So the first thing I want you to tell yourself to deal with the fear is that don't let your core identity be disturbed. What do I mean by this? So we already discussed that language learning is a great tool to diversify your identity. It is because we're also internalizing the culture, context, and custom that the foreign language belongs to when we speak the language. Therefore, by speaking the foreign language, especially if you're fluent, you are forming a new identity within yourself. That's why it feels like we are completely a different person when we're speaking a foreign language. I actually feel very much like that when I speak Korean, Japanese, and English, maybe a little bit of German, but not really sure because I'm not that fluent. I feel like a different person whenever I speak those languages or whenever I switch between those languages. So let me know in the comment section below if you're feeling like this or if you want me to talk more about this. I can totally make a dedicated video to this topic. Anyway, chances are your core identity or the vast majority of your core identity might revolve around your native language. So at this point, because you're not fluent in your target language, i.e., you don't do the vast majority of stuffs in your target language, so this explains why we should let those fears neither demotivate nor crush us, right? Simply because it shouldn't disturb our core identity. And the second thing that I want you to tell yourself is that you're still practicing the language. Speaking a second language is hard for everybody. So everybody goes through some sort of learning curve. So whenever we learn a new language, we gotta tell ourselves that it is perfectly normal to make this kind of mistakes. Grammatical mistakes, cultural mistakes, pronunciation mistakes, verbal mistakes, body language mistakes, all that kind of stuff. It is perfectly normal. And along those lines, the next thing I want to talk about is that people are much more understanding than you might think. Let's say that you made a minor mistake. For example, grammatical mistakes when talking to a native speaker. They would understand what you mean even if you made a mistake. And if you think you made a big mistake that could lead to a misunderstanding, you could still explain, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not really fluent in the language and I don't know much about the culture yet. And people will definitely understand in most of the cases. Fourthly, if you're worried about being laughed at, just let them laugh. We're not gonna care about the things that are out of our control. And their laugh is totally out of our control. Rather, we're gonna focus on something that are in our control. We gotta remember that we are not learning the language to impress them. Even if we are perfect, there will be some people judging us and laughing at us. So we're going to focus on things that are in our control. If you think you made a mistake, reflect and think about how to improve from that experience. But if you think you made no mistake, then there's no reason to be left at. Just move on. Learning a second language is hard, so we have to improve by making mistakes, by making errors. So I would suggest that give yourself plenty of room to make mistakes. So how should we do this? Firstly, I already make a video about this. I think the title is called How to Improve Your Foreign Language Speaking Skills Alone. And second way to do this is to talk to many different people, because many people could get bored by talking to the camera, it doesn't feel real or something like that. In that case, talking to people might add you some dynamics, because you're actually looking at the eyes and you're practicing common phrases and conversational languages to an actual person. In this case, you can make the same mistakes, let's say using a common phrase once or twice to each person, but to many different people. So essentially you're making the same mistakes from several to tens of times, depending on how many people you're talking to. And then it'll be easier to master those phrases, grammars, whatever you're practicing. But again, talking to many different people could be a barrier to many people. Just remember that we always have our phones and tablets to record like how we're doing. We will definitely get frustrated after making the same mistakes over and over, whether it is to a camera or to a real person. This brings us to the last chapter of this video, which is to leverage the frustration from errors. I was watching a Huberman Lab podcast and I thought it was worth sharing because it talks about learning in general and it definitely applies to the language learning. But before that, there is one concept that I'd like to introduce, which is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is brain's or nervous system's ability to change or rewire itself in response to stimuli or experience. In this case, it's going to be speaking the foreign language to people and making the mistakes. It is an important aspect in our biology when it comes to learning new things, including learning a new language. Along those lines, there are two quotes from Dr. Huberman that I'd like to share. The signal that generates plasticity is the making of errors. And errors are the basis of neuroplasticity and learning. So we're going to apply this to our language learning so that neuroplasticity could work in our favor, which is dealing with the fears that we talked about and improving our language skill. So going back to making mistakes and getting frustrated, when we make mistakes and errors, we get frustrated. And most of us don't like to get frustrated. But if we could leverage this frustration toward drilling deeper into our language skills, we're essentially inviting neuroplasticity to work in our favor, essentially setting ourselves for further improvement. So how exactly should we do this? My suggestion would be, after making those errors or mistakes and getting frustrated, we could have some time to reflect on those mistakes. Whether it is by writing down or just thinking about it, just have some time to reflect on those mistakes. And depending on what kind of error or mistakes you made, we will try our best to correct those mistakes or errors in the next tries. For example, let's say the mistake involves using a wrong phrase. What we could do after getting frustrated is that we could write them down and repeat and then try to use it in the next trier, i.e. next time we talk to a person in the language. If we make the same mistakes again, it's totally normal. Just repeat the process and then try to correct it in the next time. But what I'm trying to say essentially is that after getting frustrated, try to leverage that frustration by staying in that process for a little longer and keep drilling into that endeavor, learning the language in our case for further improvement. So this brings us to the end of this video. I guess this was quite a long video. Thank you so much for watching. Question of the day. Since we talked about fears of speaking the foreign language today, what kind of concerns do you have when speaking a foreign language, especially to other people, including native speakers? And what are your strategies to overcome those? I mean, it doesn't have to be the deepest fear, but it could be general. If you feel like it, please feel free to share in the comment section below to help each other out. And if you don't feel like it, don't worry about it. Or if you'd like to share your concerns privately, feel free to DM me on Instagram. I'll try to respond to everybody. I'm a little bit slower on DMs than YouTube, but feel free to share. If you enjoyed this video, you might like to check out this video over here that I talked about earlier, where I break down how to improve your foreign language speaking skill alone. And if you happen to watch this video, I prepare another video over here where I talk about how learning languages changed my life. Thank you so much again for watching, and I hope to see you on the other side. Bye bye.